Hi, and here we are. We're going to look at emotions now. Now in emotions, what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to focus a little bit about what are the components of emotion. And then we'll touch a little bit, just briefly, on theories of emotion. And we'll touch also on where do the emotions live, if you will, or where are they activated within our brain. And then we'll spend a fair bit of time on the expression of emotion, both in terms of how does it express from us individually, but also the universality or the cultural differences of emotion and how that plays a role in the way we express and help us in the way we sort things out, if you will. And then we'll look at a couple of other elements just regarding emotions. Gender, for example, and how we express emotions differently from the male gender and female gender. And then we'll also look at and consider emotion in thinking. And then lastly, we'll look at the significance and the role of emotion in regards to love and the psychology of love. All right, so I hope you find this particular chapter interesting and valuable to you as well. Thank you.
Now, when we look at what are the components of emotion, we first need to know that emotion is a feeling state. Now, that might seem like an obvious statement, but it's made up of three components. It's not just singly a feeling state, but we come at it from three different components. First we can start off with the physical component, and this is where the emotion is a degree of physiological arousal, and it's this physiological shift and adjustment is associated with emotion. Now the image there is just representing the different elements that can be physiological responses that are part of the emotion. Now whether that's the way your pupils respond, you don't control how they go that way. That's just purely physiological. Your heart rate, respiration, digestive activities. There's a lot of physiological component regarding emotion. When you think about an emotion that you don't just have a feeling, you have a physical or physiological response associated with that, whether it's a very good experience or a very negative experience. The second component is what we would refer to as a cognitive component. This is where we basically interpret the emotion. We have a physiological response. We start to interpret what does that mean. And so cognitively, or in another way of putting it, thinking, we start to think about, well, what does this mean? Is it that I'm happy? Is it that I'm sad? Is it that I'm surprised? Is it that I'm disgusted? So it looks at, we start to interpret. Now, over time, we gain greater strength about what do physiological responses mean, and we start to rely a little more strongly on our thinking. But that's not the only part of it either. The third part is that of a behavioral component. And the behavioral component of an emotion involves a tendency to express or not express the emotion. And so the outward expression of our emotions, facial expressions, body gestures, body postures, tone of voice, all become part of the behavioral component. And you know that even though you've had the physiological response of an emotion, you've even thought about, oh, geez, I'm embarrassed. But then the behavioral component is you'll try to hide it, or you may try not to show it. And so these things work in concert and they work collaboratively, but they are all a part of the experience of emotion. So an emotional state influences motivation. And there's the relationship or the connection between emotions and motivations. And sometimes when you feel really, in love with an idea, you're more motivated to participate in it. Whereas if you feel quite disgusted about an idea, you're less likely to be motivated to participate. So emotion, or in other words, to move, is a close relationship between emotion and motivation. A feeling state involving a physiological arousal, a cognitive appraisal of the arousal, and an outward expression or behavior of that state. So emotion is much more than just a feeling. It's a little more complex, and it's not surprising that every one person has a different emotional response to different activities or different experiences because of what they've learned. That is, what kind of physical component do they have? What kind of cognitive component have they thought about? And what is the behavioral component? And not everyone is exactly the same. So there are some theories, and I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but there is a reference to them in your textbook, and there is this chart that will help you. Now, when we're looking at these theories, these are different ways in which these three components interact and in what kind of order do they interact. So the James Lange theory of emotion claims that the physiological or the physical component of emotion triggers, initiates that cognitive and behavioral components. And you see an example in the chart above there. Now, the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion suggests that it's the cognitive and physical components that occur simultaneously, that you get these physical response and a cognitive or a thinking to interpret that almost simultaneously, rather than one leading the other. The Schlatter-Singer theory of emotion, this is a two-factor theory, and it states that both the physical and the cognitive must be present for an emotion to be expressed. So in terms of the cognitive, a cognitive interpretation or an explanation for that arousal labels the emotion. And so this is looking, instead of having one lead or there being a simultaneous, it's saying that really that both these physical and cognitive must be present, that if one of them is not present, we don't have an emotional experience. And Lazarus, their theory in emotion states that the cognitive components of emotion precede and influence the physical components. So we experience a thought about an emotion, how we might really be surprised by something, and then it influences the physical response that we have. Now, cognitive appraisal is the first step of an emotional response, and all other aspects of emotion depend on it. Okay, so I'm not going to be really concerned that you can distinguish between each and every one of these, but I think you should be aware that there are theories that look at that combination of three components and how we really still don't understand how it is that the emotions occur and how do we experience them aside from that we know we have them. So when we go on to look at emotions in the brain, we know there's some cognition associated with this, so we know there's some brain activity that goes on with the expression of emotions. It's the amygdala that plays an important role in emotion. It receives information from all of our five senses, and it's activated by fear before the cerebral cortex. So this is the thinking part of the brain, and the amygdala is really a very important element. It's also a very old element of the brain, and so emotion you could extrapolate has been a very old part of mammals in their history, in that it's been very important to recognize when we should stay and when we should run away. It's that base. Now, the cerebral cortex tempers the amygdala fear response by interpreting the situation, and it aids in our ability to overcome previously learned fears. Fear-inducing stimuli moved directly from the senses to the amygdala, which then relays the information to a higher brain centers for interpretation. And so when we look at some of the examples, we see in this sort of neuroimaging here, where different parts of the brain are activated for different emotions. And so it's in part the brain's interpretation as to how much, response to fear or degree of, if you notice with happiness, the amygdala isn't really very active. In fact, it's a different color. The arrow represents the location. And so it would suggest different degree of brain flow and neuroactivity. Sad feelings generally are located on the left hemisphere. So we look at the hemispheric conditions of emotions, the left and right hemispheres. Other emotions are generally experienced on the right hemisphere. And this is called lateralization. And this lateralization, this sort of combination of information on either side of the brains, is more pronounced in females than it is to males. Emotions are lateralized in the brain to some extent. And again, we really don't know to what degree the brain does this, other than we see in neuroimaging, there is different locations for the interpretation of different emotions. So expressing emotions. Do we express them exactly the same, and does everyone express them the same? Well, no, they don't. There's a range of emotions, and emotions are comprised in families. The anger family would be ranging from irritated to out of control. And we might be in varying degrees of a spectrum of anger, and all emotions would have this sort of range, if you will. Now, basic emotions, these are unlearned universal emotions reflected in facial expressions across all cultures. Emerge in children according to a biological timetable of development. These are the 7 most basic emotions: joy, contempt, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and fear. And these are universally understood across different cultures as being fairly common. That is to say that we can distinguish them across cultures. So if we look at the expressing of emotions, the development of facial expressions, development according to biological timetable, well, it's inborn. Some facial expressions, particularly distress or disgust, are present at birth. Expressions of sadness and happiness are evident by about 3 months of age. Between 4 and 6 months, expression of anger and surprise appear. And by 7th month, the infant shows fear. Between 18 months and 3 years, children begin to display signs of embarrassment, empathy, envy, shame, guilt, pride. The sequence of facial expressions development, this sequence is universal. It happens across cultures, which suggests a very strong biological component. Now, the universality of facial expressions, when we carry this further into adult life, we find that way back, Darwin maintained that facial expressions are universal and are universally understood. Emotions convey genetically inherited and human species characteristics. Now, cross-cultural research that's been done since then in 37 different countries suggests that some expressions are universal, but that the stimuli that elicit the various expressions to some degree vary to some degree across cultures. So what makes me smile here in Canada, there might be different conditions that make a person smile in another part of the world, but the expression of a smile is understood universally. So each culture shows a pattern of minute muscle movements that give its members a unique accent with regard to a facial expression. That is, a German happy face is not the same as a Chinese happy face, even though both are universally recognized as expressing happiness. The picture on the left that you see here is where the gentleman was asked, show me what your face would look like if you were about to have a fight. The middle image is show me what your face would look like if your child had died. And the third is show me what your face would look like when you meet a friend. And so you might recognize in these images, some recognition of universality, that if I was about to have a fight, my face might look something like the one on the left. That if someone had told me that my child had died, my face might look like the gentleman's face in the middle. And then if I had met a friend that I hadn't seen for a while, there would be my face looking similar to that as well. Now, cultural display rules for emotions. Well, display rules, these are the informal social regulations that imply when is it appropriate to express or even disguise a given emotion. It dictates how and when and where emotions should be generally expressed. We learn this early in life, and it's reinforced throughout life. Display rules vary across cultures. They can also vary across families within a culture and may be different for individuals in varying roles or occupations. So, for example, a police officer versus a retail clerk. The image that I have right down here is just a symbol that for us is okay, but in other cultures, that same symbol means something different. So when we go on to look at emotion being expressed as communication, emotional expressions serve adaptive functions. For instance, the infant expression of distress motivates her caregiver to find out what's troubling the baby. And so as a form of communication, it gets us to be responsive. It's contagious, especially positive emotions. and it has a survival value. We're able to interpret and react quickly. Now, social reinforcement is also very important because it's a process in which infants use their caregivers' facial expressions to regulate their own emotions. Deceptive emotions expressions can also be adaptive in the case of mating behavior. Now, we've often heard, and people will comment on their ability to tell whether or not someone's telling a lie or not, and humans are really poor lie detectors. At best, we're about 50-50. There are no consistent behavioral cues that reveal whether an individual is lying or telling the truth. It has a lot to do with context and each individual's life experience. Now, there are these things that are called micro-emotions that are nearly imperceptible differences in facial expressions that may help some gifted individuals distinguish between liars and truth tellers. We often use the polygraph. It's a device that measures the physiological functions that can be used to infer whether an individual is being truthful or deceptive, and unfortunately, polygraphs are not always reliable. The image you're seeing on both the left and the right there are examples of what's being established. It's what's called brain fingerprinting. It's using EEGs and fMRIs. fMRIs are functional magnetic resonating images, and they can turn out to be more reliable than the polygraph. It involves using the neuroimaging techniques such as the MRI to discriminate between deceptive and truthful statements made by an individual. Now in terms of experiencing emotion, there's a facial feedback hypothesis, the idea that the muscular movements involved in certain facial expressions produce a corresponding expression. Smiling makes one feel happy. Distinct physiological response patterns emerge for each of the emotions: fear, sadness, anger, disgust, whether lived in an emotional experience or simply made by the corresponding facial experience. So, for example, the pen exercise is to put a pen or a pencil in your mouth. If you close your mouth down over it, your facial muscles to do this produce a different emotion. That if you clench your teeth on it and have your mouth open, it gives you the similar experience to smiling, that is facially. There may not be anything funny that you're thinking about, but having that pen in your mouth between your teeth gives you the smiling out physical response that your body interprets as happy. There's some work that's been done on this fake it till you make it, standing with your head up, your chest out, your shoulders back, and a calm and relaxed breathing produces a confident experience. So learning to self-regulate emotional expression can help us in controlling our emotions. Changing the intensity by inhibiting, weakening, or amplifying its expression. Catharsis is a process of venting one's emotions. Despite popular belief, catharsis often intensifies rather than relieves unpleasant feelings such as anger and sadness. Now, we've just sort of glazed over this element of emotion as it relates to all people. What if we look at the differences of emotion expression as it relates to gender? When exposed to similar stimuli, men and women respond with different emotions. Moreover, emotions such as anger are linked to different experiences in males and females and are regulated differently by them. Similar emotions are experienced but expressed differently. Gender-specific rules govern most emotional expressions. Now, what we mean by that is that men are often taught differently how to express emotions, and women are taught differently. So these are gender-specific, and they're rule-governed, and they are taught. They are learned. They are not genetic. Women report more intense and frequent emotions, except for anger, and women also respond with greater physiological responses and reactions. So while women are hooked up to electromyographs, these are things that record emotional expression, women experience greater joy and sorrow. Cortisol levels increase in women after discussing negative events. Cortisol levels stay constant in men when they discuss negative events. So there are some physiological differences in the expression of emotions between men and women, and some of this might be genetic, and some of it can certainly be learned over time. Women may be better than men at interpreting emotions and often serve as emotional managers in relationships. Some studies indicate that females are more attuned than males to the verbal and nonverbal expressions of emotion. And you might have noticed this in any interpersonal relationships that sometimes men don't get it, or sometimes you find yourself as a woman explaining things to men differently than you would explain to your girlfriends, for example. So when you look at these sort of findings, do you see that these findings fit your experience, or are they something that you experience differently within your relationships with men and or women? When we move into emotion and cognition, emotional states can affect the way particular events are remembered. When people feel sad, they recall more negative events than when they are happy. Emotions help us to formulate a risk assessment and develop appropriate behavioral responses. Emotions allow us to detect risk more quickly than using rational thought alone. Now, the last piece I want to enter into is Sternberg's triangular theory of love. Now, what you're seeing here is his theory of love. Now, in the upper level, in the middle, is the three main features of each triangle. Intimacy, this is the blue on the right-hand side, those feelings in the relationship that promote closeness, bondedness, and connectedness. So this is something that is not shared with everybody. This is something that you share with just those people you have a greater deal of trust with, because you're sharing personal information. And it's about connecting and bonding. This is not something that you do with everyone. Then we look at passion. And passion, this is that drives a loving relationship that leads to romance, physical attraction, and sexual consummation. Now, with passion, this isn't just sex. This is the sort of connectedness, the romance, the physical attraction, the shared experience that two people have, that once the initial, physical attraction is not as new, that passion can still exist throughout a person's relationship for years, but it's about being able to explore all elements of what is passion within a relationship. And then lastly is commitment. This is commitment is short term, the decision that one person love another person, and long term is a commitment that person makes to maintain the love over time. So there's a short-term version of commitment. This is the decision that one person, loves another. It's right then and right now. And then the long term is that commitment that makes it for a long period of time. And so what his theory looks at is the different types of love that take into consideration varying degrees of either one element, two elements, or even all three elements, and what that kind of love would be like. So singularly and in combination, they produce 7 kinds of love. Liking, like the one on the left, this includes just intimacy. It's a true friendship, warmth, there's closeness, but there isn't the passion nor the commitment. And so it's just liking, and it's not a bad place to be. And in fact, many of us have many relationships that we would count among our liked friends. Then there is infatuated love, and this is on the bottom left. This is where there's only passion. It's love at first sight, and it can disappear quickly. Once the newness of that relationship wear off, there isn't any commitment and there isn't any intimacy. Then there is empty love, which is at the bottom there. And empty love is got a commitment, and it might be a commitment for the long haul, but there's no passion and there's no intimacy. Now, there are relationships like this, as there are relationships that we've had that are, infatuated love. Everybody has different reasons for the relationships that they're in. And some people, commitment is very important. Romantic love is a combination of intimacy and passion. But with romantic love, it's about there's a closeness, there's a bonding, there's an intimacy, there's passion, but there isn't a commitment for the long haul. It's romantic, but it's about the intimacy and it's about the passion. And then fatuous love is passion and commitment, but there's no intimacy. So there's a sexual relationship, there's a physical attraction, there's a commitment for a long period of time, but there's no intimacy. You don't know very much about the person. You don't know all the nuances, their likes and their dislikes, their favorite this and their favorite that. But you're with them, and it's someone that you have a passionate relationship with. And then there is a companionate, which is intimacy and commitment. And here you've got the closeness and the longevity, but there isn't a lot of passion. You may not find the physical attractiveness between one another, but you have a strong connected relationship with them, and it's long term. And then the consummate love is where you involve all three components. It's the most complete form of love. It represents the ideal love relationship. Most want it, but few can achieve it. It's a combination of having this long-term committedness, which for many people is very hard to do with the number of divorces that occur in every given year. Commitment is not easy for people to commit to. Intimacy is something that is not hard to start with, but it's hard to carry on over the long haul unless you're willing to continue to explore and continue to communicate. That by communicating to one another, you have intimacy, you have commitment, because communication is what's going to help you last a long time. And then passion, it's about finding the different elements and the nuances of each other that allow you to see that passion takes on many forms, not just the one form that you got connected with when you first started to date, for example. So I hope this has been a helpful element, this segment on emotion, and carry on the good fight and good work. We're almost there. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.